right, so Dr. Justine?
Yes.
Yes, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Alma for this wonderful opportunity for us to get into conversations regarding this particular subject of organization leadership and development. And I also thank everyone who took their time to get into this conversation this morning. As Dr. Chichetu has rightfully indicated, we want to get into a dialogue and engage in conversations that are transformational going forward. We are faced with organizations that are in chaos, organizations that are grappling with complexity issues, and the business environment, as it is normally being described, is termed to be a VUCA environment. And in this particular environment, there is no one solution that we can say we are going to adapt and implement in our organizations and get sustainable results. For us to be able to move forward as a community, for us to be able to move forward as organizations, we need to engage in conversations. And this is the structure that we are going to adopt this morning, for us to get into conversations around these two concepts and see how we can move forward as organizations and as a people. So Dr. Chichetu has already introduced me in terms of me being an alumni of ALMA and working towards bringing sustainable solutions to organizations and bringing sustainable solutions to families and to individuals through embedding values and principles that foster progress. And the field of organizational leadership and development has those fundamental principles that we can utilize in our organizations, fundamental principles that we can utilize in our families, and fundamental principles that we can use at individual level in order to ensure our societies move forward. So the conversation that we are going to be having today is looking at how do we then blend together these two concepts and bring sustainable results to organizations and to our societies. I've written 4 books, and Dr. Chichetu has indicated that. One of the books is on organization development review, which covers much of what we are going to be discussing today in the context of leadership and leading organizations into the future. I've also written numerous articles which deal with this particular subject of organization leadership, organizational leadership, and organization development. The whole essence of these publications being to advance the science, the theory, the practices, and values of these particular concepts. So we want to get into a conversation which looks at how we are going to integrate or blend or mix these two concepts in a way that moves our societies forward. And we have people here representing from different backgrounds. And I will ask you to go into the chat box and just mention your name and the perspectives that you are bringing to this conversation and where you are joining us from. So if it's Justin who is going to write in the chat box, I would say I'm Justine Chinoperekweyi, bringing organization development from Abu Dhabi. So we want to see who are the people who are representing us here, and it will help as well for Dr. Chichetu to monitor the questions and for us to get into conversations. So just take a minute and get into the chat box, write your name, the perspective or your field, and where you're joining us from this morning, as I proceed with this particular conversation and also admit others into this meeting. So these are some of the articles that I have written, and they speak into organizational leadership or organization leadership and also the issue of educational management and educational leadership, because knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer is fundamental to the principles that we are going to be discussing this morning. So to start this conversation, we have two concepts that we are going to be looking at. One is the issue of organization leadership, or in this particular context, organizational leadership. And the other is the organization development. And due to a lot of evolutions and revolutions that we see in leadership, in management, and in organization development, we have seen these fields being mixed and merged in various ways. There are a lot of manifestations that end up confusing those who practice these particular fields. So I'm going to be facilitating this conversation, number one, from an exclusionary perspective, where we need to look at each field as a standalone field. So we are going to discuss organization leadership on its own, and we are also going to discuss organization development on its own. And then we are going to look at these principles from a cumulative perspective, how they each support one another, and then a complementary perspective to see how we then get to a position where we blend these two concepts. So in various disciplines of study, we see a lot of mix and match of concepts. In organizations, we also see a lot of mix and match of different concepts. And the whole essence of that is to derive value in terms of how these concepts are going to be merged. So concepts can be looked at as standalone concepts, or we can look at them from a cumulative perspective or from a complementary perspective. And in the context of the ALMA program, we are going to look at these concepts from a cumulative and complementary perspective in terms of how we then get to have these two concepts joined together. So we have organizational leadership and organizational development, and key to that is what is the view of OD when they look at organizational leadership. When those people who are involved in organization development view leadership, what do they think about? And I look at this point from the time when organization development was introduced in the 1940s. And people were saying there is a problem in leadership. And if you ask people who are involved in executive coaching and leadership development, they will say there are issues in leadership that organization development has to resolve. And the final answer to that is that the people in OD said, to solve the leadership problems, we need to do inquiry and engagement. We can't go into organizations and say, we are the experts. We know your problems, technical and adaptive challenges, and we are going to solve these problems. The solution to leadership issues from an OD perspective is inquiry and engagement. Without inquiry and engagement, we will not solve problems sustainably. And we also have leadership looking at OD. A new field is being introduced. People who are saying we are bringing whole system thinking perspectives, and leadership is not performing to standard. And leadership said we need to engage. The solution for us to work together is through inquiry and engagement. So when OD looks at leadership, they say inquiry and engagement. And when those in leadership look at OD, they also say inquiry and engagement. So when we bring these two fields together, they are being brought together through inquiry and engagement. So whatever concept, whatever model that we are going to develop in organizational leadership, whatever model that we are going to develop in organization development, if it is not embedded in inquiry and engagement, that model is not going to be sustainable. We have certain leaders today in organizations who shun inquiry and engagement and believe that they are experts, and they try to work their way through organizations, and eventually the organizations fail. We have certain organization development consultants who say, I have been doing consulting work for the past 20 years. I have consulted in multinational organizations. I am an expert. And they just walk into Coca-Cola Zimbabwe and say, here I am. I'm going to solve your problems. And they try to bring in tools and models that they have been using before, and eventually they fail. So the blending of two concepts that we have today is founded on inquiry and engagement. It is founded on conversations. Effective leadership requires participatory approaches. It requires us to engage people. It requires us not to see ourselves as experts, but rather to be part of a community and build models that are sustainable. So when we have people in organizations who view themselves as experts, we are most likely going to fail if there are no participatory approaches. And this brings into play the recent definition of the purpose of the corporation by the United States Roundtable, where they say the purpose of the corporation is to serve all stakeholders. And this can only happen through engagement and inquiry. So the question that I will pose to us and for us to reflect on ourselves is, to what extent are we inquiring and engaging in our leadership activities? And this is leadership at personal level, at family level, or at organizational level. To what extent do we inquire? To what extent do we engage others to find lasting solutions to the problems that we have? So the fundamental principle that we have from organizational leadership and organization development is that of inquiry and engagement. And this is the whole reason why OD was introduced in the 1940s to address the challenges that were there in management if we are to review scientific management principles, the behavioral theories, and the administrative theories that were happening prior to 1940. And I'm going to be talking about that in the next slides. So inquiry and engagement is fundamental to everything that we do in leadership and in organization development. And I will ask for a comment. Dr. Chichetu, you can pick anyone to comment on their view on inquiry and engagement being central to leadership and OD. I think I'll start with Dr. Laura. Dr. Laura is taught me transformational leadership. And Dr. Laura, if you can start the conversation on the significance of inquiry and engagement in leadership and organization development.
Dr. Justin.
Yes.
I hope we are not using this as payback time to Dr. Laura, eh?
Not really. not really. She's someone I learned from.
Yes, Dr. Laura.
Okay, very interesting and a very good approach to leadership, organizational leadership and development. The thought that's coming to my mind is that a lot of times when we are consultants or have a service, we can tend to be very inward focused and not outward focused. We are not looking at what the needs are of the people that we want to serve. And so I think this puts us in a good direction to be able to say, let's not be too impressed with ourselves. It's good that we have certain competencies, but when we think about whatever we are doing as being outcome based and not competence based or outcome focused and not competence focused, then this approach of having both inquiry and engagement begins to make sense. So thank you very much for starting us on this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Laura. Dr. Chichet, you can pick one more before I proceed. Inquiry and engagement being fundamental to conversations that we should have in leadership and conversations that we should have in organization development.
Thank you. Let me have Rumbi Mchenje. Hi, Rumbi.
Hi, I'm here.
Yes, I know. I can see you work with the young people. The whole concept of inquiry and engagement being central to organizational leadership and development. What's your take on that?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shetty, and thank you, Dr. Justine, for starting us off. I think for me, I work with young people, but as I was listening to you, I thought of it, what you were saying about it being fundamental on a family level. And I've noticed it also, like with my family, we've got sessions where we sit down and as a family, we talk about what's happening and the progress that we want to make in projects that we are doing, and also just getting inquiry, like it's my dad who starts with it, and also just involves the whole family in terms of my brothers and myself, just to hear their thoughts in terms of, okay, this is what I've decided to do. So how do you think we should go about it? And because of that, I've seen how this is strengthening the family and also just bringing out confidence in each one of us in the family. And this is something I think I've also been learning as I've been working with the young people and the volunteers I work with as we do leadership trainings, to also say, with every class that we start with, let's start with asking the young people, so at what level are you at? You know, we want to be able to start from there so that we're not just coming with this program and just place it on you, but being able to say, okay, you're at this level. So let us be able to see how we can be able to work together to move along. So being able to inquire and being able to get their feedback is very, very important. So thank you so much for starting us on that.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So inquiry and engagement, the reason why I brought that, I'm going to be talking about the timeline at which we saw organization development being introduced to complement or support organization leadership and management. Leadership and management has been there from the time of Frederick Taylor, the scientific management. We had the issues of Henry Fayol, who brought in the administrative management. And at that point in time, organization development was not being discussed. So we see a field that was coming into play to support organizational leadership and management. So things have their roots and branches. Affairs have their beginnings and ends. To know what is first and what is last will lead one near the way. And this is the Confucian classic from the Great Learning. And we also have the Taoist philosophy where they say the Tao produced the one produced the two produced the three, and the three produced the 10,000 things. And what that means to us is that everything has its own beginnings, and we can't ignore the early beginnings of any concept. We can't ignore the early beginnings of any field of study. We see a lot of manifestations in terms of organizational leadership. Today, if Dr. Justine does a PhD, he wants to do a certain model just to validate my PhD. If someone is studying leadership today, they want to develop a model and say, these are the 7 Ps of leadership. And the next person will come and say, these are the 7 S of leadership. So we have a lot of manifestations in leadership and the way organizations should be run. And it's becoming so confusing because some of these manifestations that we see have no scientific relevance. They are not validated in any way, but I'm lying on my bed and I want to write an article for social media, and I say, today I'm going to write about the 7 P's of leadership. And then there it is on social media, and people adopt that. So we see a lot of manifestations in the way organizations should be led to such an extent that it's becoming confusing in terms of how should organizations should be run. So we need to get back to the basics and say, what are the early beginnings and where are we today? What is the first one that produced the two that produced the 3, and the 3 that produced the many manifestations we see today? For you to understand Dr. Justine, you need to go back to Zimbabwe, Kutanda, Kwarusabe, where Justine grew up. Then you would really understand, why does Justine act the way he does? If you just look at Dr. Justine in Abu Dhabi and you think you know Dr. Justine, you'll be lying to yourself. For us to understand AUMA, we need to go back to the fundamental philosophies and the concepts that led to AUMA. What led to AUMA being established as Africa Leadership and Management Academy? Then you will be able to understand AUMA. So everything has its own early beginnings, and we need to go back to the early beginnings and be able to understand where we are today. When we are teaching leadership, we need to go back to where leadership started. When people were saying leaders are born and they are not meant, and then different models start being developed to be where we are today. So we are going to look at some of those historical backgrounds of organizational leadership and organization development and see how they are now blended together. For us to understand a fruit in any tree, we need to understand the roots. It doesn't necessarily that because the trees are planted in the same gardens, in the same garden, they're going to produce the same fruit in terms of how the fruits taste. So understanding the roots, the early beginnings of any field will help us moving forward. Today, we have a lot of people in learning and development. It is now an industry where people just want to make money and they just come to your organization and say, Mr. Hassan Tawakoli, you are working in Afghanistan. I can do learning and development and train your staff. On what basis? On the basis that it's a money-making machine. But if we embed our training programs, if we embed our understanding of leadership and organization development on the early beginnings, I'm a student of AUMA, and whatever AUMA taught was embedded in biblical integration, because that is the foundation, that is the early beginnings of the program. So the early beginnings help us understand where we are going as organizations. So when we look at organizational leadership, we need to look at organizational leadership from self, family and friends, teams and organization, and then to society. We have a lot of people who work in organizations at organizational leadership level, and yet they fail at self and family level. So as the previous speaker, Rumbi, has indicated, the principles that we learn at self-leadership are essential at family leadership and are essential at organizational leadership. So we can't talk of organizational leadership without going back to self and family leadership.